My name is Jeff Schumacher. I'm the Vice President of Exhibits and Programs here. It's great to see such a great large audience for our first public program of 2023. This promises to be a really great conversation we're going to have tonight as we mark the 40th anniversary of the Jimmy Chagra murder trial. 40 years since one of Oscar's great moments as a defense attorney. Before we jump into it, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Catherine Chagra. Catherine is the eldest.
Hi.
Catherine is the eldest daughter of Jimmy Chagra, and she's written a memoir, this one, which will be available later, that provides a very personal perspective on the rise and fall of her father. Catherine will share some of her memories and thoughts tonight. She'll also be available to sign copies of the book after the program. So let's go with a second applause for her. Please welcome Catherine Chagra. Our other panelist is a familiar and popular face around the Mob Museum, of course. Oscar Goodman was a defense attorney in Las Vegas for 30 years, during which he represented an array of individuals. I word this very carefully, so an array of individuals accused of being involved in organized crime. Is that good?
Not very good. Not very good.
One of those individuals.
They were alleged, okay?
They were also accused. In his second act, Oscar served as the mayor of Las Vegas for 12 years. And amid all that, he was the chief visionary of the Mob Museum. So please welcome Oscar Goodman. Okay, so I'm going to very briefly set the stage for our dialogue tonight, and then I'm going to talk as little as possible after that. So on the morning of May 29th, 1979, U.S. District Judge John Wood was shot as he stood beside his car outside his townhouse in San Antonio, Texas. A bullet fired from a high-powered rifle struck him in the back and lodged in his chest. He died very quickly. I want to show a short video that was sort of news coverage from the time.
Filled with anguish, Miss Wood stood outside the Chateau de Jean townhomes off Broadway.
The look of horror she had, it was just like this. Oh.
As EMTs frantically worked to save federal Judge John Wood's life.
The entry of the bullet was from the lower back.
Within minutes, Eyewitness News reporter Gary DeLon arrived on the scene.
Took the life of Judge Wood yesterday.
He had one leg inside the car, then body was on the ground. Door was still open.
The 63-year-old's murder outside his home ignited a fury to track down the killer.
We're in a shooting war.
At the time, Archie Pierce was a young prosecutor.
He was objective, and he was not subject to that undue, many times corrupt influence that was in El Paso.
Judge Wood's harsh sentences on drug criminals earned him a reputation.
They had several nicknames, I think. Maximum John, Hang 'em High John.
So the FBI launched a massive investigation, the most extensive and expensive search for a killer since the investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy. 70 FBI special agents were assigned to the case. They interviewed 30,000 people and logged more than 82,000 man-hours. Altogether, the FBI spent something like $11 million on the case. And that does not include all the work that was done by the DEA and the IRS. 2 years later, the FBI investigation led to Charles Harrelson, a career criminal and the estranged father of actor Woody Harrelson. The FBI believed that Harrelson fired the fatal shot and that he was paid $250,000 to do it. So the question is, who paid him? Federal prosecutors alleged that Jimmy Chagra, a prominent marijuana trafficker and Las Vegas high roller, had paid Harrelson the money. So that's a very brief overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. But before we dive into the legal case, let's go back a few years, and I want to provide some context for this true crime drama. And I want to start with you, Oscar. I mentioned a minute ago that Jimmy was a Las Vegas high roller. He gambled huge amounts of money in town. What was his reputation in Las Vegas, and then how did you two meet?
Well, his reputation was that of the biggest whale who ever gambled here. When he walked into a casino, particularly Caesar's Palace, they all stopped their dealing and they applauded him. There came a time that they actually built a trophy to give to him because he was so generous in his tipping after he was through playing a particular gambling game. And he was known all over amongst gamblers throughout the world. He really was a character, and that's something that Las Vegas is missing these days from the old days. There aren't that many characters around anymore, but Jimmy was one of the last of the characters, and he and myself didn't know each other. His brother Lee, and I hope I'm not getting ahead of us.
You're okay.
His brother Lee was the oldest brother of 3 brothers, and Lee was a wonderful lawyer. He was probably the best lawyer in West Texas. And on a Super Bowl day, he was up at his law office, and the law office was highly technical as far as electronic equipment was concerned, and people buzzed their way in, and they came in, and they robbed Lee, and they took money from the safe that Lee had there, and money that Lee had in a boot, and shot him needlessly. There was no reason for it. And unfortunately, the bullet just nicked the aorta, and Lee bled to death. And then to top it off, they put cocaine in Lee's mouth. I had met Lee, and as a matter of fact, Lee was going to hire me, at least we had discussions, in order to sue Judge Wood, because Judge Wood would pick on all of Lee's clients. Lee had a practice representing a lot of persons accused of drug dealing. And Judge Wood would create a jurisdiction to get these cases. Judge Wood instructed the U.S. Attorney's Office there that if a plane was flying from Florida to Los Angeles and it just went this much over Texas, Judge Wood wanted them to indict for a conspiracy that took place in Texas, so he would be able to try the case and then impose a sentence, and the sentence was always a maximum sentence. And Lee had it. So that's how I met Lee. The grand jury met about Lee's murder, and a fellow out here, Johnny Quinn, you may know him, an old-timer, he had a nephew who was subpoenaed before that grand jury, and Johnny hired me to go down and represent the nephew at an El Paso grand jury. And I went in there, and as soon as I went in, they said, "Go home, Goodman, your client is not a suspect." And we turned around, and this fella who looked very much like the picture down there, very much like Jimmy, was Jimmy. And he says, "Are you the lawyer from Vegas?" I said, "Yes." He says, "I may be calling you one of these days." I said, "Why?" He says, "I think I'm going to have some problems with this grand jury." I said, "Well, that's what I do for a living. I represent people who have problems with grand juries and U.S. attorney's offices," and didn't expect to hear from him. And on the way out, he said, "You could do me a favor." I said, "What's that?" He says, "You know, I live in Las Vegas part-time, and there's this home that I'm interested in. It's a home on Viking Road. It has a facade of bricks. It had an ox's yoke on the front, and I'd like to buy that home for my maid." And I said, "That's my home." So that's the way Jimmy and I really got to know each other for the first time.
And we did indeed get ahead a little ways, but that's okay. Catherine, please give your perspective on your father and your own experiences as a young girl here in Las Vegas.
Okay, so I'm Jimmy Chagra's firstborn child, and we were extremely close. I always wanted to be with him, as far as I can remember. He was just so fun to be with. He was very lighthearted and liked to laugh all the time, and he loved music. And my very first memory with my father was in El Paso. He had bought 2 houses. That was one of his first big scores. And he had bought 2 houses and connected them with a hallway, and he kind of made it into a big compound. And it had a pool, and he would throw me up in the air, and there was music playing. I think it was Stevie Wonder, "Isn't She Lovely?" And he would throw me up in the air and he'd go, "You're so beautiful. I'm so lucky you're my daughter. You're such a beautiful little girl. I'm so lucky to be your father." And then when he made all the money, the first big score was $8 million in the Boston with the tramp steamers, where he loaded the marijuana up the cliffs. That's a detailed story, but he bought a huge estate in Coral Gables in Florida. Then he just loved Vegas, so then he moved to Vegas, and he bought a home. He was remodeling it, and so we lived in Caesar's Palace in the Frank Sinatra suite. And so I always wanted to be with Dad, no matter where he went. And I'm 9 years old. And I'm like, "Daddy, I want to go with you gambling." And he's like, "Okay, come on, let's go." And, we would go to down to the casino. And I'm telling you, I remember it vividly. The crowd would part ways, just Jimmy Chagra's here. And there would be tables roped off. And Dad would roll the dice, and everybody around him would go, "Come on, Shiggy Shag." I mean, it was just like huge. And I don't know how much money he had on those, probably, 250,000 or maybe more, who knows. But, and then for school, I had a wake-up call, in the suite. We had 2 bodyguards guarding the front of the suite. It was double doors. And I'd have a wake-up call to get me up for school. And as I was going out with the bodyguard to go to Montessori Academy, Dad was coming in, and he'd go, bad night, my darling. I lost $1 million." And I didn't really know what that meant. I just was like, "Okay, Daddy, I'll see you later," and went to school.
I wanted to share one little item just to give you an idea, and Oscar alluded to it. The dealers in Las Vegas loved Jimmy, and the reason they did is he was, and not just the dealers, but cocktail waitresses and all kinds of casino employees loved him, and because he was a huge tipper, and the tips that he gave in 1978 would be very, very big tips today. I mean, that's how big they were. And I picked up this story. There was a Caesars employee named Rick Burks, and this is what he said in one of his memories of Jimmy Chagra. He said, "I worked in the Caesars casino cage when he would come in to play. He brought a footlocker filled with cash, and we would sort and count it. So he would say it's about $250,000, and we would give him a front money slip for that amount so that he could go and play. So it was actually $253,000, and so he gave the overage to the cage. So the employees in the cage got to split $3,000. He said he always tipped the dealers, cocktail waitresses, and all others very well. When he was arrested, the dice dealers joked about bailing him out." I want to go back to this house just for a minute. Oscar joked about it. You lived across the street from him, literally.
Yes, I did. Yes.
According to Gary Cartwright, a writer who has wrote a great book about the Chagra story, he talks about this house, and Jimmy spent $1 million renovating the house. I haven't gone over on Viking Road in a while, but I assume it's still there. I don't know. But here's the quote. "He was especially proud of the master bedroom. It was as large as 3 normal rooms, and except for the lavender drapes, which his wife at the time, Liz, selected, everything in the room was mirrors. Mirrored walls, mirrored ceiling, mirrored floor, even mirrored furniture." Does this sound familiar?
Yep, exactly.
The main piece of furniture was a canopied 4-poster, the width of 2 king-size mattresses made of mirrors and polished chrome. Concealed in the headboard was a console of buttons and switches controlling a number of electronic gadgets, including a 6-foot TV screen that appeared from behind a panel of mirrors, more mirrors, a fireplace that burned artificial wood that's not unusual, right? But a sauna-like environmental chamber that could simulate rain, Baja sun, jungle steam, spring showers, or a Chinook wind. So that's quite a house.
Yeah, I remember that. Dad loved nature. I mean, but I would just like to say he was 40 years ahead of his time, because I don't know who in 1976 would think of building something like that in their bedroom.
Right.
I remember going in it. It was pretty cool.
Oscar, while we're still in Las Vegas, I want to talk about, before we go to Texas with the serious stuff, although this could have been serious, I want to ask you about Jimmy's involvement or potential involvement with another one of your prominent clients, Tony Spilotro.
Oh, well, I told Jimmy that after the murder case and the acquittal, I said, you know, Jimmy, I saved your life twice. And he says, what do you mean? I said, remember one day that I called you up because I had another client come to my law office, and he was steaming. It was Tony Spilotro. Spilotro had sat in a seat that Jimmy used to vacate in a booth at one of the nightclubs right off the strip. And Jimmy was sitting there, and he was ruling the roost, and Tony, who was a diminutive fella, came in. He says, that's my seat. Jimmy said, who are you talking to? Tony said, I'm talking to you. He says, get out of here, you midget. Well, with that, Tony spun around, and he came down to my office. He says, I'm going to teach a guy a lesson. I said, what are you talking about? And he tells me the story. I said, I think that guy is a client of mine. Let me put this together. And I called up Jimmy. I said, Jimmy, come down to my office right away. So Jimmy's in my office. Tony's in my office. I said, we need a détente, fellas. I can't represent both of you at the same time. If you're having a beef with one another, shake hands and let's get along. And they shook hands, and from that point in time, they were friends together.
Good job, Oscar.
And thank goodness for that.
Yeah, really. Thank goodness for that.
So, Oscar, you alluded to it earlier, but, you know, about Lee Chagra, and, you know, it was Jimmy and then it was Joe. And this was a very prominent family in El Paso at the time. And can you, maybe both of you talk a little bit about El Paso and what was going on there, why Lee was, you know, so prominent?
Well, Lee, as I said, was the foremost criminal defense lawyer, particularly when it came to represent clients who were charged with drug offenses. And he traveled all over Texas, and he traveled into Oklahoma, and he was a great lawyer. And that reputation spread very, very quickly, and people in the community recognized him as such. He was a striking man. He usually wore a white suit with a black hat, and he had a cane or a walking stick and a silver handle on it. And he was not shy in order to let people know who he was. And the family was a working family. This was not a family that was sitting back spending the money that Jimmy would give them or Lee would get them. They owned a little carpet store. And the thing that I remember the most is when I would visit Jimmy in jail down there in Bexar County, his mother would, I always say hello to her. I said, hi, Mrs. Chagra. She said, hi, Oscar. I said, you know, I'm going up to see Jimmy and visit with him. And the thing he loves the most is your kibbe. And if you don't know what that is, it's a Lebanese dish made out of bulgur and beef, I believe.
Yeah, it's meat.
And I went to the jailer and I said, you know, I'd like to bring Jimmy some kibbe. That's the one thing that he misses while he's in jail. And he says, oh, we can't do that. I said, how about if Mrs. Chagra makes it for all of the jailers? He said, bring it up right away. So that's another job that I did as a lawyer. I brought people kibbe.
Catherine, you were young at the time, but do you have any recollections of sort of just how you guys were treated in El Paso?
I mean, I had the happiest childhood before Lee's murder. Everybody loved us, and I was really proud to be a Chagra, you know, and I just thought they were really special people. They were really loud. They were always laughing. They said, Yadini, come here, Yadini, Yadini, which means my darling in Arabic. And they were extremely affectionate, and we seemed to be well respected in the community. My Chagra relatives were extremely religious, Catholic faith, and went to St. Patrick's Cathedral a lot, and they gave a lot to the community, gave back to the community, were charitable, and really loving people.
They were Lebanese background.
Yes.
Right. And they had a little carpet business and nothing more than that. And they worked every day like regular stiffs work and like they were supposed to. And people liked them because they were kind and they were gentle people. Jimmy was the middle son, and Jimmy just lived life to the fullest. When he left in the morning, I think he probably said, "Carpe diem." I'm going to seize the day, and he lived every second of it.
And to be fair, one of the ways he lived life to the fullest was to become one of the biggest marijuana traffickers in American history, which certainly had its issues, and he ended up getting indicted for drug trafficking.
That's correct. But he was not a good marijuana trafficker. I don't know. I don't want to hurt your feelings, Catherine. Yeah. I don't want to hurt your feelings. No. But your father was not a good marijuana trafficker, and he was even a worse cocaine trafficker, because I never saw a guy like this in my life. It seemed to me when I'm representing him, because they were using boats to ship the substance across the high seas. They were having planes, and the boats sunk, and the planes crashed. And I don't know how they ever made a cent, because I never heard of a successful venture. But I guess there must be so much money in it that it didn't really matter.
There must have been a few successful.
I guess so. I never saw it.
Well,
who laughed when I said that?
Let's go ahead and just dive into the drug case, because I think and you can explain why, but I mean, you weren't quite as successful with that case.
No, and it's a great disappointment to me. By the way, I just want you to look at my briefcase. It usually left Las Vegas empty, and Mr. Green got in it, and I brought him back. Somewhere is that ring that I was telling you about. I don't see it on my finger, but Catherine's, yes, it's there. Catherine's dad gave me a ring. He would give gifts to people that he had affection for. Catherine right now was wearing the Freedom bracelet, which is, I think, probably more important to her than the diamond bracelet that she's wearing.
Yeah.
And look how young and handsome I was. This is a very frustrating to me.
I would just note, Oscar, you called attention to the picture for another reason, which is that's the briefcase that's on display.
That's
down
correct.
the hallway from
That's
us
correct.
here.
And you'll see I have a pair of cowboy boots. Coming from Philadelphia originally, if a person said, "Would you like a pair of boots?" the first thing that came to my mind was a galosh, that you wear during a snowstorm or a rainstorm. And I said, "Sure, I could use a pair of boots." Well, I won a particular motion, and Joe, who was the younger brother on I guess it would be the left-hand side of the picture there, and
Yep.
then his sister is in the middle, and Mrs. Chagra, the mother, is right behind my shoulder. Joe said, "What would you like?" I said, "Oh, I don't care. I just did what I'm supposed to do." He said, "Would you like a pair of boots?" So I figured he's going to get me a galosh. Well, he takes me to Lucchese, which is at that time, maybe still, the most expensive bootmaker in the world. And he says, "What would you like?" And I said, "These aren't galoshes, these are cowboy boots." He says, "Well, they're very stylish, and you can have any one that you want." And the person who was waiting on the people said, "Here's the most beautiful boot." It was and I don't want to offend any PETA people here, but it was an alligator boot. It was black. It was gorgeous. And I said, "That's a beautiful boot. How much is it?" He said, $7,500. I said, "Well, I'd like to try it on." And just to tell people I tried a $7,500 boot on. I put it on. I got it halfway up my foot. I started pulling. I pulled, and I could never get it up. But we got the second most expensive boots, which I have at my home, and I'm going to give it to the Mob Museum as soon as Jonathan Ullman, the director, comes over and helps me get it down from some closet that it's in, because I just am not a boot kind of guy right now. But that reminds me of, I'll tell you how bad it was when they were investigating Jimmy. Jimmy would give me money to pay for incidentals. And I went to court with him in San Antonio, And I took a cab from the airport, and I gave the cab driver $20. He said, no, it's only $8. I said, well, I'll take the change, or give it to yourself as a tip. He said, no, I'm not going to give you a tip. I said, then keep it. He said, no, I'm not going to keep it. I said, then pick me up at the end of the day. So I never thought I'd see him again. I do my business in court. I come out, and he says to me, what were you here for? I said, I had to go to court. He says, we're here on they called it the Chagra case? I said, yes, I was. And he says, that's Chagra. That's Chagra, this is the kind of animus there was in the communities where these things were taking place. That Chagra is such a bad man. He's such a bad man, and Judge Wood is such a good man. And Judge Wood sends people away forever, and that Chagra is such a bad man. I would take Chagra and I put him up on that flagpole, and I would put honey in his eyes, and I would put ants in the honey. And he says, and what were you doing here? I said, oh, I'm with the FBI.
So, Oscar, why don't we make sure we cover the drug trial? Just
Yeah,
real
well,
quick.
the drug
But the
trial-
important thing to note is that Judge Wood was not. He was scheduled to be the judge.
We were scheduled to go to trial on May the 29th of 1979. The judge's clerk called Jimmy's parole officer out here, and they advised that the judge had moved the case into July. So there were only a few people, maybe Jimmy, myself, the probation officer, and the world did not realize that the case wasn't going to start on the 29th, and actually everyone believed that it was, and that's the day that the judge was assassinated. I was sitting in the probation officer's office at the time when we found out, and Jimmy actually threw up in the office. That's how upset he was to hear something like that. That made me think right away that Jimmy had no animus. He didn't like the judge. I would like a man who, if I lost the case, would give me a maximum sentence. But we were dealing initially with cocaine and marijuana counts. And I was in a position where I could work out a deal if I wanted to, where he would take 2 marijuana counts, which would be a total of 5 years, eligible for a parole at the end of 3 or 4. But they wanted 1 cocaine count, which was 10 years, and that was not parolable, and he would have to do 10. So it made no sense, and he said, let's go to trial. I said, that's what you hired me for. And but that was a main part of my defense later on, because I said, nobody's going to kill a federal judge over a 2-year difference in what had been offered and what was rejected. So we went to trial, and of course the government upped the case. In other words, the marijuana count and the cocaine count, they were no longer in existence. It was now the kingpin count, where if Jimmy were found guilty, you get as much as 30 years. That's the punishment that you get if you don't do what the government wants you to do, and they make an offer that you refuse, and he refused it. And I really believe that I was winning the case. I know it's hard to believe because it was a good, interesting case, but I thought I was going to win it, not on a technicality, but they were able to prove marijuana, they were able to prove cocaine, but they couldn't prove that he was the kingpin because there were 3 or 4 other people who were defendants in the case who were unindicted with him, and I was able to plan a defense where you don't have 4 different bosses, you have 1 boss, and they were more culpable than Jimmy. So I felt pretty good about going to, it's funny, this all comes back. I'm glad I'm here tonight. I was going to argue to the jury on August the 14th, and my wife called me. I was in the hotel room, and she said, your dad passed away. And I didn't even know my father was ill. And I was heartbroken because he probably was my closest friend. And I went in to see Judge Sessions, who turned out to be a bum. Oh, you remember, he's the Attorney General who was fired, and he's the one whose wife was using government employees to bring in her laundry and her grocery stores. But he was rectitude. He sat up straight. He looked like he had a pole up his rear end. And that's the way he ran his courtroom. And I said, Your Honor, can I see you at about 7 in the morning? And when I went in there, Jeff and Catherine, he was talking to the court reporter, that's the stenographer, and I'll swear on my life they were changing the transcript. And I caught them going in there, and I said, Judge, my dad passed away, and under my religion, he has to be buried immediately. And I'd like to have permission to leave. I'll be back tomorrow morning, but I have to get back to Philadelphia for the funeral. Oh, no, Mr. Goodman, you're a professional. You'll be able to do it. Well, folks, let me tell you this. When I stood in front of that jury, I didn't know where I was. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I was doing. Jimmy had no chance because his lawyer's mind was just boggled at that time. And the judge didn't feel bad about it at all because this judge was not, I wasn't a favorite of him. Matter of fact, he made me join the state bar of the Western District of Texas so he could hold me in contempt. He was afraid that I would go back to Las Vegas. He wouldn't get a hold of me and bring me back and put me in the pokey. It's a true story. And I came back and we lost that case. But Jimmy was very sensitive. With everything you hear about him, he was a sensitive fella. He said, I'm so sorry about your dad. He said, let me get my pilot. He had several pilots to fly you back to Philadelphia, and then you could come back and represent me. So I flew back to Philadelphia on his private plane, or a private plane that he had access to, and buried my father. And from that point on, I couldn't look at Judge Sessions. I couldn't look at anything that had to do with Judge Sessions. In my opinion, he was as bad as any judge that I've ever tried a matter before. He had no sensitivity whatsoever. And but for Jimmy, I wouldn't have been able to go see my father interred at his funeral.
You got a 30-year sentence for the drug charges.
He got a 30-year sentence. It's the most he could get. He couldn't give him any more if he'd like to.
But he skipped bail. And what happened then?
Well, he absconded. He did not show up. And I got to tell you that I wasn't crying over that. But he would call me. I said, Jimmy, I can't talk to you. You're a fugitive. He says, well, what am I supposed to do? I said, you can't ask me. As far as I'm concerned, all I could do, because every conversation that I had in those days was being overheard because of Tony Spilaccio or because of Jimmy Chagra. Every place I went, there was a bug. And I said, I can't tell you anything to do but to come back. You have to surrender. And he didn't do that. And then one day, and Jimmy, your dad wasn't the smartest guy. One day, it dawns on him, and he wasn't the handsomest guy.
Okay, I'm going to let it slide, Oscar.
It's
Go
all right.
ahead.
You'll have your turn. You'll have your turn, Catherine. I'm not selling books tonight. You are, okay? It dawns on him that and he was happy. He was living in Kansas City, Kansas. He had his family of that time and his wife at that time, different from Catherine's blood relatives. And they had a little house there, and all Jimmy wanted to do in the house was to watch television. Black and white was fine, and see sporting events. He enlisted his children in the local school. He could have stayed there forever, but no, Jimmy Chagra was smarter than everybody, and Jimmy Chagra made arrangements to come back here. Las Vegas, of all places. He couldn't go to Puerto Rico or to Miami or to Omaha. He had to come back to Las Vegas, where he lived, for a cosmetic surgery, plastic surgery, so that it would change the way he looked. And Jimmy comes driving into town, and he looks out, and every policeman in the world is looking for the guy. His pictures in every post office imaginable. And Jimmy puts the brakes on, hops out of the car. He sees a local cop, and he says, "You got me. I give up." The cop had no idea who he was. He says, "I surrender." So the cop said, "Who are you?" He said, I'm Jimmy Chagra." The cop said, "All right, you're under arrest." And the cop went into Jimmy's trunk, and he found diaper bags or diaper boxes. And Jimmy indicates that he had $850,000, I believe, in those diaper boxes that he was bringing with him. And when they finally gave him an inventory for it, there was about 830.
Well, 180.
180.
Yeah,
180. Some of these cops, I think, may be living in St. George at this time.
Yeah.
Compliments of Jimmy Chagra.
And probably DEA agents as well when they raided our houses. And
Yeah, so,
Well, Catherine, I want to give you a chance to talk about that, because what happened with all of this legal activity against your father is it really left your family in a tough spot. Can you talk about that period of your life?
Okay, well, after the murder of Lee was the patriarch of our family. And you have to remember, Lee was only 43 and my father 36 when Lee was murdered. And so everybody loved Lee, everybody loved Lee so much. And everybody just panicked, like, who are we going to turn to now, And Dad didn't know how to handle it. He was devastated and blamed himself because he always assumed that he would be the one who would be killed, not Lee. You know what I mean? And so, we were just completely blindsided by the death of the patriarch of the Chagra family. So they raided Lee's law office and found evidence to indict my father, which was illegal. It was a state crime. So the DEA and the FBI shouldn't have been in there to begin with, but they were. And they found the evidence to indict my father. And then after that, they raided all of our homes. I was telling Oscar a minute ago, like, all the Chagras were these freedom bracelets, every single one. They were specially made for the Chagra family. And then Oscar said, I had one. And I was like, you did? And he's like, yeah, I had one. I'm like, what happened to it? He goes, someone stole it, but whatever. And then I showed Oscar this ring. I go, where's the ring that Dad gave you? And he goes, well, I didn't wear it, but it was way bigger than your ring. He goes, your ring is chump change. I was like, thanks, Oscar.
Well,
But
Catherine,
anyway.
if you look at the picture there,
Yeah,
you'll see Jimmy's right arm,
yeah,
and you see his pinky. Okay?
okay.
That's my ring.
Okay. But in any case, they raided. We had 3 homes on one street in El Paso on Santa Anita, and they just 70 FBI agents just raided all the homes. And my aunt said her intercom went off, and she's like, "Who is it?" And she said she was naked. She just woke up. It was like 9 a.m. And it's like, "It's the FBI, ma'am." And she goes, "The FBI? Okay, what do I put on for the FBI?" And so she, puts a robe on and opens the door. And they're like, she's like, what are you doing here? And they're like, the female FBI agent goes, "Don't you know your brother is Al Capone?" And they just searched everything, took everything. My father had so much custom jewelry. He was really big on custom jewelry and diamonds and things like that. He had a lot of it made at Caesar's Palace in the jewelry stores there, and he made me a freedom bracelet. But he and I both freedom bracelets, but this time it had diamonds all around. And the clasp had broke, and so it was in our safe in the mansion in Las Vegas. And so then they raided that house and took, all of our jewelry and everything else. So they pretty much took everything, including Dad always drove a Mercedes, Liz always drove the Lincoln. They took the cars, they took the jewelry, they took the minks. I mean, Liz had so many minks. Oscar and I were saying earlier, right? Like 15 to 20 minks, and they took it all. I think Dad, after everything was said and done, he had a couple million left, and he left that in Joe's control because the Lebanese culture, my mom was like, "You need to leave it with me because I'll take care of everybody," But the Lebanese culture, unfortunately, a lot like the Italian culture, especially in the 70s, the men give, it's all about the men. And so even though Joe was only 28 years old, he was in charge, and he tried to do what he could to be the patriarch, but there was no way that Joe could handle everything that was going on with our family.
No.
So it was a tough time at that time for you guys.
It was devastating. It was devastating, yeah.
I want to get to we got to get to the murder trial, but before Jimmy, the trial for Jimmy, there's actually other people who've been accused of this crime, and they're all adjudicated. Can you kind of lay that out, Oscar?
Yes, of course. An indictment was returned in San Antonio. charging Jimmy, Liz, his wife, Charles Harrelson, who is the father of Woody Harrelson, the actor, Harrelson's wife, Harrelson's wife's daughter, and Joe Chagra, and they were charged with conspiracy to murder the judge and murdering the judge. I was moving for two things. I wanted to get the trial out of Texas because, as I said, with the cab driver, there was a animus and a hatred that I didn't feel a fair trial was possible at that point in time. With every day, it was in the newspaper, it was on TV, and I didn't think that they stood much of a chance. And he wouldn't move it out. And then I moved for a severance. I wanted to get Jimmy away from the other people in the case because I figured that I would do better than they would because there were some lawyers in the case, and I didn't care for myself. They were trying to butter up the prosecutors and be friends with the prosecutors. And in a case like that, there are no friendships. It's a war. They have their job, and if they do it right, they're entitled to a conviction, and if they do it wrong, they're not entitled to conviction. That's the way I would practice. Well, I was getting nowhere fast with Judge Sessions until we're picking a jury, and the judge says, we just received something from Mrs. Wood, the widow of Maximum John. It was a letter that had been written the day before by Liz Chagra, Jimmy's wife, and delivered to the judge's widow, and it said words to this effect. Dear Mrs. Wood, I am Liz Chagra, and I am a born-again Christian. And I just want you to know that I did not have anything to do with the murder of your husband. One day I was cooking fried chicken in my kitchen, and my husband Jimmy came in and said, I'm going to kill me a federal judge. Well, with that caused a situation that it was impossible to have them tried together, and it was very important to the government that they get that statement into evidence. So the judge reluctantly granted my severance. The others all went to trial. They were all found guilty. They all got maximum sentences, and the judge sent our case down to Jacksonville because Jacksonville and San Antonio are both in the same circuit. It's in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the appellate law, which lawyers rely upon and judges make rulings on, comes from a particular circuit where the trial was taking place. So Jimmy and myself were heading down to Jacksonville for the trial, where Jimmy was by himself in the courtroom with me. And if you can imagine this, it was like David and Goliath. Here I was with Jimmy. On one side of the room, the two of us, and then on the other side of the room, it was like this audience here, with U.S. attorneys, with strike force attorneys, with DEA agents, with ATF agents. I never saw anything like it. The office staff came down, paralegals. It was like an impossible situation, and I loved it. That's exactly what I wanted. I wanted it to look like what it was, and that was that they were going to use all the power of the federal government to get my client, and it was just him and me, and that's the way we tried the case.
And Oscar, just to make sure we understand, so Charles Harrelson was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to 2 life terms.
Yes, and but for the fact that we were successful in defending Jimmy, had Jimmy been found guilty, under the law of the state of Texas, Harrelson would have gotten the death penalty.
So, and Joe Chagra pleaded guilty.
Joe Chagra pleaded guilty.
He got 10 years.
And did 8.
He agreed to testify against others.
He would not testify against Jimmy, he
But
said.
the others.
Yes.
And then this is the killer, but Jimmy's second wife, Liz, got 30 years.
30 years for delivering a suitcase to Harrelson.
And we'll get back to that in a minute. So now we're in Jacksonville.
We're in Jacksonville, which I like very, very much. Jacksonville is a very interesting town. Whenever you wake up in the morning, you don't know whether you're going to see snowflakes or warm weather or rain. And I love getting up, and I was staying at the Hilton. This is a story that has nothing to do with anything, by the way, so you can go to the restroom if you have to. I woke up every morning, and I would walk across the the bridge connecting where the Hilton was to the courthouse where the trial was taking place. And I was carrying those 2 big briefcases that I had filled with books. I would walk back. I'd have lunch with Jimmy in the cell. At the end of the day, I would take my briefcases and go back to the hotel. And my wife came down after 6 weeks when I was in trial just to say hi to me. And she said, "Oh my God, what happened?" I said, "What do you mean what happened?" She says, "You're buff." I made her so I became like buff. I looked like I was very tough. And we tried the case, and one thing after another took place. Would you like me to talk about that, or not yet?
Let me ask you a couple of specific ones. So,
Okay.
I think a big part of this case was the testimony of Jerry Ray James and the problem with that.
Well,
explain who he was and.
Yes. Jerry Ray James was maybe the worst of the worst as far as federal state prisoners. He was doing, I think, 50 years, 40 years in the New Mexico prison system. He led the raid, if you'll recall, on the prison where they captured the guards, and they took broomsticks and stuck the broomsticks in every orifice that was available to them with the guards and people who were informants. And Jerry Ray James found out that Jimmy was at Leavenworth, and Jerry Ray James was a pretty smart guy. He went to the warden. He said, "Warden, I'd like to talk to the governor." And the warden said, "What do you want to talk to the governor about?" He says, "Oh, I know this guy Chagra, and the government really wants him. They want him more than they want me, and I want to make a deal." So the governor sent a representative over to talk to Wallace.
James.
To James.
Yeah.
And James worked out this deal. The smartest guy maybe in the whole case was the governor of New Mexico. He allowed James to get out as part of the deal on the condition that he go into Leavenworth and try to entrap Jimmy into confessing to the murder of the judge, and with the condition that James was never allowed to come back to New Mexico. So he was no dummy, this guy. And they put James in a cell right next to Jimmy, and they put bugs in the radios there and bugs in the wall. And James befriended Jimmy, and they walked around the yard together. And when it came time for the trial, James was the primary live witness against Jimmy, and he testified that Jimmy said to him while he was in the yard, and would talk to him all the time about killing this federal judge. And Jimmy would puff up, and James would be recording every conversation that he had with Jimmy. And James is testifying, and I was able to elicit, although they gave me this in discovery, that James had received $200,000 from the Texas Bar Association and $250,000 from the American Bar Association for his cooperation against Chagra. And I asked him about that. He couldn't deny it because I had that in black and white from the various bar associations. And I said, you took that money freely and voluntarily, didn't you, James? And he said, yes, but I didn't do anything wrong. I said, well, you took that money and you bought your wife a Mercedes with the money that the government gave you, the blood money, in order to testify against my client. He said, oh, I never bought my wife a Mercedes. Well, there was a fellow in town here by the name of Andy Granby Hanley. He and his father, Tom, were involved in the bombing of supper clubs here in town, and I was representing the secretary-treasurer of the culinary union at the time. And for some reason, they liked it. Even though they were on the other side as government witnesses, they sort of took a liking to me. And I got a phone call from Andy Granby, and he says, Mr. Goodman, he said, did you know that James bought his wife a Mercedes? I said, I heard that, but I'll never be able to prove it. He's going to get on the stand. He's going to deny it. He says, don't worry about that. He says, I have the VIN number, the vehicle identification number. I said, could you get that to me? I said, I'll do one better than that. He said, I'll get you a copy of it. So I'm asking James about this, and James denied it, and I shoved it into his face, and I said, now read it to the jury. And of course, it had the VIN number of a Mercedes that he gave his wife. Now, that's the first time that I felt during the trial that I had made an impact on the jury, because they went like that. I mean, they couldn't believe that he was getting this kind of money and he was spending it the way he was spending it, and there was something that stunk about it. And that's the way we started with James. And James testified that Jimmy was in the yard, and wherever Jimmy went, Jimmy would say he killed the judge. And I would question him, did he say that he killed any other people? Everybody that you mentioned, Jimmy, he killed him. I said, okay, I just wanted to get that straight. And I tossed James aside because James helped me because of the way the government treated him like a prima donna. And who knows, he may still be in the witness protection program living next to one of your folks, because they don't let the next door neighbor, they don't let the next door neighbor know when one of these scumbags comes and settles next door to him. So I don't know where James is. I hope he's dead, but I don't know. And
So there's a part 2 to the,
yeah, but
to the Jerry Ray James.
Oh, yeah, I'm not there. Shall you get there now?
Yep.
Okay. They go through their whole case, the government does, and the judge, Judge Sessions again, he says, you don't have a defense, do you? I said, well, I'm his lawyer. I certainly have a defense. He says, how long is it going to take? Like, he's in a hurry, this guy. My client's doing 30 years and looking at a life sentence. I said, take your time, Judge. Take it easy. I'll have a defense tomorrow morning. He said, well, you better be ready to start at 9 o'clock. And the prosecution's looking at me. They can't understand. I mean, they already had, in their minds, they had the champagne and the caviar, and they were having their party. They were getting their promotions. So they can't figure out what I'm going to do. They said, they're probably going to put Chagra on the stand. He makes a terrible witness, and that'd be great. So I said, well, my first witness is Jerry Ray James. And they're looking at each other. The judge is looking at the prosecutor. Prosecutor's looking at the prosecutor. The DEA is looking at the DA. And they're all looking at me like I'm nuts, because this is the primary witness against my client. I said, you're the same Jerry Ray James that testified before, right? And you testified that my client would tell you that he killed Judge Wood. That's right. And he told you he killed other people. That's right. And you believed him, didn't you? He said, I sure did. I said, you believed him when he said he killed Judge Wood? Absolutely. And when he talked about these other people, you believed him then? Absolutely. I said, do you remember the name of any of these people who he supposedly killed? He said, I sure do. I said, what's the name? And he says, a guy by the name of Paul Finney. I said, I have no further questions. The two prosecutors look at each other, the DEA, the FBI, they're all sitting here like this. They don't know what I'm doing. It's like I'm nuts. The judge said, do you have any other witnesses, Mr. Goodman? I said, I sure do. And I opened up the door and I said, please come in, sir. I said, go up there and go under oath. And please state your name. Paul Finney. True story.
It is a true story.
True story. So I took care of that part of the case.
So the other one that, there's a lot of different elements to this case, but another one that really stands out was, and keep in mind, we mentioned earlier that, the government's case was $11 million investigation. Prosecution, David and Goliath situation. They've got all kinds of prosecutors, all kinds of money to prepare their case. They got all these witnesses, and they have a diorama that they've created.
Great.
Talk about that.
I didn't know what a diorama was. I thought it was some loose bowel movement or something when I first heard the word. But a diorama is an exhibit, and they had, it was a great exhibit. It really was.
It's actually a museum term, right? Because in the old days, museums would create dioramas of all kinds of scenarios.
Okay, well, I would have called it a big exhibit, but it was a diorama, and it was made by the government, and it was to a T of the apartment complex that you saw earlier today, the Chateau de Jean apartment that the judge had been staying at when he was killed. And they had the louvers on the windows, the exact color that they were on May the 29th. They had the cars that were in the parking lot because, of course, every car had been photographed by law enforcement in response to the judge's death. And everything was to a T. And they had even the trees were up in the place that the trees were. And they brought a woman in who was a lawyer in town, and the first time over my objection, she was hypnotized in order to bring back her memory. She said that she saw who the gunman was, and under the hypnosis, she said that it was Harrelson that shot the gun, and she talked about the trajectory of the bullet that killed the judge, and it was a beautiful exhibit. I mean, it really was. And I said to the judge, I said, may I approach your Honor's clerk? And he was angry that I asked to approach the clerk. That's, I represented Jimmy Chagra. So he said, all right. I said, may I borrow some Kleenex? And now the jury's looking at me like I'm half nuts. And the clerk looks up. The judge says, they give me the Kleenex. I said, now, do you happen to have a green magic marker? Well, I guess I'm really pushing the buttons now. And I'll give him a green magic marker. So I'm there. I'm not going to use my jalapeno. But I'm there, and I take this diorama, and I start with the Kleenex. And I take the magic marker, and it's like this. And the jury, they can't figure out what I'm doing, and have a little green Kleenex, and I put it on I don't want to mess up my drink, but I'm going to in the name of the Mob Museum. It's, okay, this was green, and then the next one, green, green, green. And I said, to the FBI agent who was laying the foundation to get the diorama into evidence, I said, now, when were these pictures taken? He said, oh, in February. The pictures of the trees were in February. I said, that's why there are no leaves on it. When the gun was shot, it was May 29th, and San Antonio was in full bloom, was it not? And every tree had the leaves on it. And it was impossible that the trajectory of the bullet could have been the way this hypnotized lawyer said it was. Nowhere would it have been possible for it to get from where she was to where the judge was when he was shot. So I think the green Kleenex had as much to do with the win. But see, that's why I like to drink. I'm going to go to my drinking soon because my liver's beginning to quiver. And there's a reason, because I drink to excess, and I admit it. But it's good for you. It really is. I have a very large brain cells as a reason. And I'm not bragging, it's just a fact. And I believe that it's the gin that does it. But I picked that up out of nowhere. They tried the whole first case with the Harrelson and that crew. Nobody picked it up. They had the same exhibit. Nobody even thought of looking at it. But it just dawned on me that there was something wrong with the exhibit. They didn't have leaves on the tree. And the jury, with that, they started to go like this. And at that point in time, I just knew it was a matter of time until if they were going to do their job, that they would find my client not guilty.
Oscar, what was essentially in your closing argument and in general was your defense? In other words, what were you saying?
That my client didn't do it, Jeff. What do you think?
Well, I understand. But Harrelson received money.
Well, I'm saying that the government was going to do anything in order to get a conviction. They didn't care. They had their livelihoods on the line. An FBI agent who I spoke with afterwards, he told me that there were more FBI agents in that case who got divorced as a result of working on the case than any other case in the history of the Bureau. I mean, they really wanted my client, and they wanted him for the murder of the judge. So when I had these opportunities to take advantage of misconduct, as far as I'm concerned, or creation of false evidence, they weren't entitled to a conviction. Yeah. I mean, they went so far, when Jimmy was talking to Liz in Leavenworth, I don't know whether I mentioned this before, and they were talking to each other, and she went to the ladies' room, and they had a trap in the toilet, and she ripped up what they were saying to each other. They wouldn't talk to one another because they were fearing it was going to be overheard. And when she flushed the toilet, it went into the trap. And when she left, they went into the trap and picked it up and sent it back to some poor schlemiel FBI agent who had to put it together.
Where I was going with that, it was the defense was that Harrelson extorted the money from.
That's what
Chagra.
to this day, I could not go under oath and say that Harrelson was the gunman. No way.
He was an
I would not-
extortionist. That was the idea.
Pardon me?
He was an extortionist. He was trying to get money.
The guy was he was nuts too. I mean, have you ever looked in somebody's eyes? Had you ever met Harrelson? No.
Fortunately, no. I
Good,
never
I'm glad. I was
met.
going to tell you if you
No.
were going to answer, I was going to tell you to take the fifth. Harrelson's eyes were robin egg blue without the little black thing in it. You know, the pupil.
No pupil. Right?
He had no pupils. You saw into his lack of soul. I mean, that's the kind of fella he was. And one story that I haven't told, and there was a writer, James McManus. He wrote a book called Suddenly Fifth Street, a book about poker tournaments here in Las Vegas. And he said, listen to this one. This is what I had to live with. He writes, as I can't even spit it out. He writes, as lore would have it, Oscar Goodman met with Benny Binion and Charles Harrelson and Jimmy Chagra at the Horseshoe, and they conspired to kill the federal judge. As lore would have it. So I hired a lawyer, because I wasn't going to allow that to remain ever. And I said, all I want you to do is tell McManus, if he has somebody who gave him this information, or if he can show that he got it from a legitimate source and did not make it out of whole cloth, I'm not going to do anything. I'll live with it because it never, ever happened. And they went to McManus, and after, he made it up, as lore would have it. And I said, sue him. And what I want is I want a lot of money. I want it taken out of the book. And I want a full-page ad in the New York Times book section. And I got them all three. But the best thing is this. McManus was walking down the street, and he saw me. He began to run. And I had lost my buffness.
So the case goes to the jury.
Case goes to the jury.
And there's 20 hours of deliberations. What happened?
20 hours?
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know why it took so long. There were two other counts, and I did something that I'd never done in my life. There was a importation of marijuana that they had thrown in with the murder and the conspiracy to murder, and an attempt to escape, I believe, because there was a guy by the name of Wright who agreed with Jimmy that he was going to fly a helicopter into Leavenworth and fly him out, how to live with this nut. And I thought that maybe I wasn't as smart as I thought I was, and I thought that maybe the only thing that they're hung up on is the murder and the conspiracy to murder. And they came back on Sunday, and they said that they're hopelessly deadlocked on 2 counts. And I was scared to death. Then I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I said to Jimmy, I think we roll the dice, Jimmy. I think this is the best I'll ever be able to do for you as far as the trial is concerned. Everything broke my way. I did what I had to do. And they came back the next day. They found him not guilty of the murder and the conspiracy to murder, and found him guilty. And the funny part about it, even though I conceded the marijuana count and the obstruction or escape count, they were 10-2 for acquittal on that. They hated the government by the time I got through with them. And well, they should.
Yeah.
And well, they should, because, if you let the government get away with this kind of stuff, it could happen to any one of us. And you may not be able to afford a lawyer as good as me. No, I'm just kidding there. But
No, it's
we
true.
can't allow our government. Nothing's different. It's 40 years later. We can't allow our government to engage in misconduct. It's intolerable, and I couldn't even celebrate it. I had to come back. I had to come back to Las Vegas. Bellagio had been arrested on a count out of Kansas City, and he was waiting for me to get him out of jail here. And my office had all sorts of balloons and all sorts of nonsense like that waiting for me. I said, no, I have to go over and get Tony out of jail. But
So, Oscar, let's look at
yes.
two quotes that were in the newspaper the next day. First of all, Chagra said, "Thank God for Oscar Goodman."
I like that quote.
I'm glad, he said, "I'm glad I'm in Jacksonville where there are 12 honest citizens."
I like that quote.
And the question I guess it poses is, do you think you could have had the same success if the trial had been held in Texas?
With the feeling that I had from the cab driver, it was so deeply ingrained, and it was a second nature to think that Jimmy was a bad guy in Texas. In Jacksonville, they never knew who Jimmy Chagra was, and they just knew what the government had done. I did not put Jimmy on the stand. He's a terrible witness. I don't know. But as I said, I think maybe if if Harrelson had a different kind of representation, something could have. I don't think I could have won with the way it was configured, because one would have to testify against the other,
Yeah.
and it would be like the Tower of Babel. It would all fall down. But
Now, this is your quote. "The verdict speaks more eloquently than anything I could say. I can't believe it. In my opinion, it's the biggest acquittal, the most significant acquittal in the history of the jury system."
well,
That's
I'm
pretty
not
strong.
shy. I'm not shy. There's a book written which you haven't gotten for me, and
I know.
I begged you for
Very
it.
hard to get.
It's called Famous Jury Arguments.
Arguments, yeah.
And my argument in the Chagra case is included in that book, along with Clarence Darrow and Socrates and all these great legal minds. And we can't find the book. Somebody took my book. And I'll put an award out there. If you find my book, I'll give you Catherine's rings.
Now, the good news for Jimmy was that
You're so
he was acquitted of the murder charge. The bad news is he was just really in the early stages of his sentence for drugs.
And the bad news was,
Liz.
this is a shame.
Yeah.
I took my family right after the acquittal over to Israel to bar mitzvah my youngest son at the wall there. And when I got back to Las Vegas about 2 weeks later, they told me that Jimmy had gone to the public defender's office down there to get the public defender to make a deal if Jimmy admitted to killing the judge and trying to kill the prosecutor in the case, they would let his wife get a reduced sentence of the 30 years that she received from the judge. And he went forward and did this. I don't know what drove him to do that. I don't know what happened.
It was guilt.
Excuse me?
It was guilt. He just felt so guilty that Liz was.
Well, I'm just saying it was a bad mistake because
Yeah.
the government didn't do anything they said they were going to do. And she got the 30 years. She did the 30 years until she got ovarian cancer. And Jimmy called me and he said, could you please go before the clemency board or the pardons board? It just shows you that life is a funny thing. And he said, please represent her there. Try to get her to come home so she could die with her children around her at least. And I wasn't her lawyer. I said, can I call her lawyer? He said, don't even. I said, I'm going to call him. He said, take a shot. I'm happy to take a shot. And I said, okay. And I get a phone call from, I still remember his name, Mick. I don't know. He was the FBI agent who was assigned to Liz Chagra. And he called me. And he said, I'd like to go to the board with you and make an impassioned plea that she's done enough and she should be able to go home. And you know what they gave her? Nothing.
Yeah.
And she had just given birth when they arrested her. So she had 3 babies, a year difference of all 3 of them, and they were tiny. So it was pretty bad for them.
Yeah, it was very, very sad because, you know, Jimmy was a strong personality. And if Jimmy really said to her that I want you to take money to pay off Harrelson because he killed the judge, that's one thing. But I know Jimmy, and Jimmy said, take this money over to a hotel room and give it to Harrelson or somebody, or Harrelson's daughter. And he never told Liz that, that he killed the judge.
No.
I really believe that.
Well, I'm just saying in the early years, I was very young, but it was understood. It was just understood that he didn't do it and that he couldn't believe how everything had happened. I know he, smuggled marijuana. I know it was illegal, but just what happened to our family was a disgrace, and he just insisted over and over and over that he didn't do it.
Well, it doesn't make any sense. As I said when we started, it's a difference of 5 years. He could have taken the cocaine count, gotten 10. He could have taken the 2 marijuana counts, gotten 5. You don't do what they said he did for 5 years. You just don't do it.
Now, we're running a little longer than we wanted to. We want to definitely get some questions from the audience. But before we do that, I want to give you a chance, Catherine, to kind of explain the basis of your book. In other words, it's a memoir. It's your own words,
Right.
but your mother was working on a book.
Okay, so
you explain how that.
Sure,
that
sure, and I'll try to do it fast, Jeff. No one, if you recall, Oscar, no one had interviewed my father. It was all other people talking about my father in the press, and like as that cab driver thought, it was brutal, and no one spoke to him. He didn't get a chance to tell anyone his side of the story, except for my mother. And they were divorced, and my mother, my father put my mother through hell. He left her penniless with 3 children. But she knew Dad. She knew him very, very well and loved him, as a friend, as the father of his children. And she was a seeker of justice. And so she kept visiting Dad in prison and interviewing him, and in his words, detailed what exactly happened, what transpired. I didn't know anything about this because I was 12 years old when this was happening. So 30 years later, or 40 years later, let me think, 2010, I think it was. Yeah, there were floods in Austin, and a friend of my mother's house was flooded all the way to the attic. And my mother, she died of cancer in 1986. So I didn't even know these transcripts existed. So the house was flooded, and the owner of the home called me. He said, "Kathy, I hear you're trying to write a book. I found a box that has cassette tapes." It said Chagra on the box, and it has cassette tapes and transcripts. And these transcripts are dated 1982, details hundreds and hundreds of pages of what exactly happened. And so I was like, I know my mother was trying to write a book, and so I wanted to incorporate both my parents' words because, like you say, it was history. And I wanted to stand up for my father because I know he wasn't a bad person. He was very special. He was just so fun and funny and really the most optimistic person I ever knew in my life, because even in prison, you guys, he was fun. And the guards loved him. I mean, they loved him. And he had nicknames for them, and he would, I had just bought my first condo. I was 25 years old, and I was able to purchase my own little townhouse. And my dad, he always wanted to try to help me in my life in some way or another. And he'd be like, "Baby, what do you need for your condo?" And, he's sitting in jail, but I'm like, "Oh, well, I guess I could use some Southwestern pictures, Southwestern, because I'm in Arizona." And he's like, "Okay, honey." And I go visit him, and he goes, "Okay, when you leave, park your car at the end of the yard there." And I said, "Why?" He goes, "Just do it." I said, "Okay." I get out prison. I drive at the end. I can see my dad, the shadow in the behind the concrete, and he's screaming, "Yeah, baby, I love you." And then all the security or the correctional officers are coming out carrying paintings, Southwest paintings that came from the walls in the prison. they're loading him in my truck, in the trunk of my car. And I'm like, okay, Dad, I mean, that's pretty cool. You got the guards, you got the correctional officers to steal paintings from the walls in the prison. Good job, Dad, thanks. But
Well, why don't we open it up for questions? We're always going to use a microphone for the questions, so we'll bring around a mic if you raise your hand. We'll start here.
Well, my head is spinning trying to internalize the story, but my question is, the FBI, the government, had already gotten a bunch of people and put them in prison for this. Why were they so hot spending all these incredible resources trying to get Jimmy? What was it about him that made them want to go to this incredible effort?
No, they thought Jimmy was the kingpin, and they thought that he is fellow responsible for sentencing the judge to his death, and they weren't going to allow that to go unanswered. It really didn't matter to them whether or not there was a severance. They weren't going to quit then. As I said, it was David versus Goliath, and that never changed.
They saw him as the kingpin, and everybody else was an accessory, essentially, except Harrelson. All right, next question. Anybody? If you raise your hand. There's one.
Hi. So you said that Liz wrote a letter to the judge saying that
To the judge's wife.
to the judge's wife, that she was a Christian and that Jimmy said he murdered. Okay. But after all that, he still went to the prosecutor's office and tried to defend her and say he did it after she got 30 years? Is that right?
are you asking me?
Either one.
Oh, okay. So she wrote that letter, and my mother details in the transcript exactly why she did it. She was terrified. She had just given birth. She's in prison. She's away from her little babies. She was being beaten and other sordid things happening. She was a young woman. I think she was 28 years old. And she didn't know where to turn. She was terrified. I mean, it's terrifying when the government gets their grip on you. They'll do anything to make your life a living hell. And that's what they did to my family. And so she navigated towards the Christians in the prison, and they were telling her, confess. Jesus wants you to confess. So you need to confess. And so they talked her into writing that letter. And so she did. And what was your question? Dad trying to get her out, or the prosecutor? Okay, so Dad was guilt-ridden. He's sitting in that prison, and in the first 2 years of his incarceration, they moved him to 16 different prisons, and they were always in solitary confinement. And they would put this thing on his wrists and the cuffs his wrists together up to his elbows, what inmates call the black box. And they would keep that on him until your wrists turned black. And they would move him constantly before 30 days was up, because he would try to call Oscar, and he'd be like, I want to talk to my lawyer, I want to talk to my lawyer. And then they would move him to another prison, so he couldn't get his commissary for coffee, cigarettes, or talk to an attorney. So he was just in his head feeling so guilt-ridden about Liz being in prison with their babies at home, you know.
He thought he could get her a more lenient sentence if he would plead guilty.
Yeah.
All right, another question.
Who do they think actually murdered the judge? Did they ever?
Well,
was acquitted?
so Harrelson was convicted, but I think these folks here feel like maybe Harrelson didn't actually do it. What's your thought, Oscar?
I didn't hear the question.
Who actually killed the judge?
No, you know what, that question is one not about the judge. Do you realize when they found the barrel in Lake Mead with the body in it and the bullet in the back of the head, that I've gotten hundreds of phone calls wanting to know whether I know who did it, who it was, and whether I ordered it.
I have several theories in my book of who did it. They're just theories, because everyone is deceased that really knows.
My follow-up question would be then, could they charge someone? See, he was acquitted. Could they turn around and charge someone else?
Yeah.
Yeah, in
Yes.
theory. Yeah.
They can't charge you. Well, that's another story. But they can't charge somebody. It'd be double jeopardy. But they figured out a law that got around the double jeopardy, the RICO law, the Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organization, where I have won murder cases and drug cases with juries, and then they file a RICO charge using the murder and the judge, and the murder and the drugs as the predicate acts. And I've argued double jeopardy, and you know, the system is not a fair system. Let me put it that way. And that's why defensive lawyers are important, because at least they try to keep the other side honest.
To try to just at least suggest an answer to your question, there's been a fair amount of research out there in regard to whether Charles Harrelson actually committed this. And there are people who question whether he was the shooter. And so you can look into that further if you're curious. But I don't think anybody knows for sure. You know, it's like a lot of these cases.
And when he was arrested, Jeff.
And Charles Harrelson's no saint, as you've learned, but that doesn't necessarily mean he did this.
And when he was arrested, he had confessed to the murder of JFK as being one of the 3 people at the Dealey Plaza.
That's
so
true.
you're going to rely on this? No.
Another question.
Yeah, I've got a question. Did Mr. Chagra die in prison, or?
No, he got out. We never thought he would get out. He remarried when he was in prison, and he appeared to be happy. But he passed away about 3 years ago.
Oh,
2008.
2008.
He got out in 2003, and he died in 2008.
Well, it seems like yesterday to me.
Did he ever come back to Vegas during the time?
Yes.
Yes.
That's one of the first places he came.
Yep. He lived in Arizona for most of that time, right?
Well, okay, so when he was released, it wasn't how I dreamed. I dreamed that I'd come to pick him out from jail, and we'd go, have dinner. And no, what happened was the FBI scooped him up. They took him, he was still in witness protection. They took him to Atlanta, Georgia. They changed his name to James Madrid. And he met a woman there and married. And he was trying to get a job. And he never broke the law again, I'll tell you that. But he was trying to do mortgages. And then he decided he wanted his real name back. And so he got off the program. He came back to Arizona. He lived with me for a little while in my house. I just had a baby. I had my daughter the year that my dad got released from prison. And so he lived with us for a little bit. And then he went to Vegas for a while and married his wife there and gambled. And we went down to New Orleans, and I watched him win $30,000 playing blackjack in like 5 minutes. He still had it. And, so yeah, he had a good, at least he died a free man, and he had a good 5 years, and with a woman that loved him, so.
We could probably take one more question if anybody has one. Right here. Hold on.
Yeah, when Oscar was talking about James in jail with all the bugs and everything, did the government ever get anything out of those bugs? Obviously they didn't, but what was the outcome of that?
He was talking to Chagra, and he had Chagra say that Chagra killed this guy and killed that guy, and they felt that was sufficient evidence to use James as a witness against Chagra until I was able to set that on their head.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Again, very important, we're going to have a book signing with Catherine out in the courtroom waiting room outside the back doors. And so please consider getting a book from Catherine and having her sign it and inscribe it for you. Otherwise, thank you all very much for coming tonight. I hope you enjoyed it.